In this lesson, we'll talk about using viewport filters in Mudbox. So another method of getting our project a little bit more on target as far as the final result would be to add things like ambient occlusion or depth of field, things that would exist in the final result. So to do that, we can use viewport filters. You'll see there's a list here of a few different filters that we can apply. The open circle means that they're not applied. When we click a closed circle, that means they're going to apply that particular viewport filter. So for instance, let's say that we wanted to add ambient occlusion. So we wanted to add some darkness in some of the areas that would be occluded. We can turn on this ambient occlusion. Now if we want to actually change the parameters, we can, or the properties, we can click on the name. So we'll click on ambient occlusion. You can see we can still rotate around and sculpt and work on our model. The lighting is still all there as well. We can change the number of casts and directions. We can also change the cast length. So if I dial this length up or pull it back, you can see I can kind of tighten up that occlusion. You can kind of look in these areas up here to see that effect. Okay, so here's without, here's with. So it kind of adds a little bit of depth in some of those larger overall areas. We can also, choose to fade it out a little bit quicker if we want to. We can choose to turn on the blur, which I think looks a little bit better. If you only want to see the ambient occlusion without the color shading, we can turn on ambient occlusion, and that may help you to kind of dial this in a little bit. So if you want to take your number of casts up or change the length, and you can see how that sort of affects the look in your scene just by coming in here. Okay, and then to see your final scene again, you can go ahead and turn on only ambient occlusion, or turn off only ambient occlusion. Now we also might want to get some darkness in some of the crevices on these, kind of bring out some of the details. So we can turn on cavity ambient occlusion. If we do that, you can see we get some darkness in these wrinkles, and it really brings out the detail. If I turn up this strength, you can see it really overdrives that, but you can tell where that effect is happening. It's in all of those little creases in there. So you can kind of dial that strength back down a little bit. Okay, we can choose quality, so there's good, better, and best, and depending on how well your model turns around and works, you can change these values to get the effect that you want. So we can kind of dial that in to get a better look on him as far as the kind of bringing those details out. We still haven't painted any texture, but we're just adding that kind of darkness, and it really serves to bring out the details that are on him. And kind of play with the sample radius, kind of blurs out a little bit or tightens up as we come in here. All right, and so at any time you can turn either one of these off. So here's without the ambient occlusion, and then here's without the cavity. And so you can do any combination of those that you want. All right, we can also turn on, let's say, screen distance. And so this will give us kind of a Z depth. So this is further back, this is further forward, this is the furthest forward, so it's kind of a depth pass that we can have here. We can also use normal map. So this would be kind of this whole scene as a normal map. So you can actually set up detail this way. So if you were to sculpt kind of mechanical panels in here and then just turn on our normal map filter, you can export that as a normal map. And then we have also non-photorealistic, where you can create something more like a sketch, kind of really mess with the values here to create something interesting. So it's a little bit more for fun, for a probably very specific purpose. Okay, and you can see there aren't really any properties for normal map. Also we have tone mapper, so we can kind of change the gamma on here if we want to, and then also depth of field. So let's come in here, let's turn these two back on. So let's go to depth of field, and I want this guy to be in focus, and we're going to move him eventually, but just for now we'll leave him where he is. But I want him to be in focus, and I want everything else to be in kind of blurred out a little bit, because he's supposed to be very tiny. So let's go ahead and change the focus distance, and you can kind of see that as it moves through the scene as I change this value. So dialing it in, he's at about 210, 215, something like that. So I can dial it in there, and then I can change the depth of field. So I can take this all the way down. Let's increase the blur amount. So you can see only just the front part of his face, and maybe his little hand is in focus. Or I can increase that depth of field to where he is in focus and just this whole area right here is in focus, but the background is out of focus. And you can change that blur amount if you want to, so that it gives you a little bit more of an effect that kind of he's a very tiny little guy here. All right. Now keep in mind that as we move the camera, that focus distance remains the same. It's not always going to be focused on him. So you want to set up kind of your shot, which we'll do, and then set that blur. But you can, it's not really a render. You can come in here and actually start to paint on him, paint and sculpt if you wanted to. All right, so make sure to check out those viewport filters. The depth of field will give you this kind of focus on him. You can also change the cavity ambient occlusion and ambient occlusion to kind of darken in the crevices and the occluded areas. And then there's some other ones that you can play around with that we are not going to use through this course, but we'll use these three for sure. All right, so now that we've taken a look at our viewport filters, let's talk a little bit about UVs. So the UV process is going to be important. There are ways to paint in Mudbox without UVs. We'll look at that as well, but UV-based textures are going to be the main texture that we're going to be using. And so we'll talk a little bit about those UVs and the UV process here in Mudbox in the next lesson.